Hello, good morning. Welcome to the Trey Olds Radio Show. Thank you for joining us today. Today, my special guest is actor and voice actor Mr. Neil Ross. Thank you, and join us in a minute. Okay, my first question to you is, how did your career begin? How did you get started in the voiceover industry?
Well, that is a long and convoluted journey, which I chronicle in my book, which hopefully we'll be able to discuss at some point in this interview. But arguably, you could say the journey began when I was, 5, 6, 7 years old, when I became fascinated by the various voices and accents that I heard coming out of my little radio. We didn't have a television set at that time, so it was pretty much the radio and the record player. And as I say, I had no interest in music at that point. I just would listen to voices, even if I didn't understand the topic they were discussing. I just was fascinated by voices. And then I would begin to try to reproduce them in the privacy of my room. My father referred to it as talking to myself. I don't know why I was doing it. I was not trying to prepare for a career in voiceovers. I didn't even know that existed, and maybe it didn't exist at that point. Who knows? But anyway, that's been sort of a lifelong fascination, just doing silly voices and characters, and I was influenced by a number of radio shows that I heard and some recordings that I heard. And then about the age of 12, I heard my first rock and roll record, which was Little Richard singing Tutti Frutti.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the first music I ever really liked. That stuff just grabbed me. This electric thrill went from the tips of my toes to the top of my head. And I've always been a rock and roll guy ever since then. And that led me, because I had not a shred of musical talent, I couldn't be in a band, but I ended up being a disc jockey. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what you do as a disc jockey sort of is a distant cousin to what you do in voiceovers. So that I did for the next 20 plus years, and then eventually discovered that the voiceover business existed and realized that I was really only using, 40% of my talent in radio, whereas voiceovers, I thought, if I could break in, I would be using close to 100% of whatever talent I have. And I thought, this is the job for me. So I set about making that happen in the late 70s, early 80s. It took me about 5 years to break in once I got to Los Angeles, and the rest is history.
Absolutely, and you've been doing voiceovers ever since.
Yeah, there was a bit of a career overlap. I got out of radio in 85, but my voiceover career really started to cook around 82. So for about a 2.5, 3 year period, I was juggling both jobs, but finally the tail started wagging the dog, and I just said, I can't do this radio anymore. It's interfering with my voiceover work. So I quit a perfectly good, full-paying job because I was just so much more successful on the outside at that point. And counterintuitively, that was the first time I ever had any job security in my life, because the radio business is horrible. They fire people. It's gotten much, much worse recently because of the deregulation and all these giant corporations buying up all the radio stations. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole unless you want to. But even before any of that happened, radio was a miserable business. I always say it's the only business I know where they eat the young and the old. And once I quit the radio job, I couldn't be fired. I was freelance. I could lose my agent, but at the time I was successful enough to where I could have gone to another agent in a heartbeat. So as long as I could show up for the auditions and book enough jobs, I was my own boss, and there was no miserable corporate so-and-so who could come in and fire me on a whim. I was free from those people. It was great.
Yeah, and that's the best way to do it, on your own. You don't have to depend on these corporations or big, you know.
Well, the guy said to me years and years ago, he said, "You're never going to make any money working for somebody else. Why would they let you have all the money? They want the money."
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, to a greater or lesser degree, that's true. I mean, if you want to be a disc jockey, unless you somehow manage to buy your own station, you do have to work for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And, the handful of people who can reliably deliver huge ratings, they get paid pretty well. Or in the case of Howard Stern, a guy who can deliver a bunch of subscribers, he's very well compensated. But the average radio person, oh, man, it's terrible. And, and it's not all about money. I mean, I loved, and I still love doing voiceovers. It was just so much more fun, so much more challenging than radio ever was. That even if I hadn't made a lot of money, I would have been happy. Just really, honestly, my goal was just to get into voiceovers and hopefully make a living.
Mm-hmm.
It really wasn't about money. It was about the challenge and the love for the business once I got in it and realized exactly what it was all about.
Yeah, you have to enjoy it and have the passion for it. And once you get into it, the money will come along, but you just can't get into it just for the money,
No. And, that to me, and I'm certainly not the person who invented this thought, but, if you can get up in the morning and go do something that pays you a living that you love and enjoy and would do for free if there was no other alternative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is such a gift, because most people drag themselves to some job they don't really care about and just put in the time. I mean, what a horrible way to live. But other than dealing with the traffic to get there, I just love voice work. It's endlessly rewarding and fascinating. And so what a wonderful way to make a living, right?
Oh, absolutely. I've done voice work. I started my own radio show podcast in 2013, and I was a disc jockey for a few years. Then I discovered voiceover work and then community theater work, and I kind of dabbled in all of that, and I enjoy it. I get up every morning and can't wait to interview somebody or do whatever voice work comes my way. I'm just happy to be in this industry.
Well, we are both very fortunate to be able to do something we love.
Absolutely.
As opposed to just putting in the time,
Yeah, I would find that very boring, just, putting in the time. Well, my next question is, we're going to shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about your book. It's called Voice Recall, A Life in Radio.
You're close. It's actually Vocal Recall.
Vocal Recall, A Life in Radio and Voiceovers.
That's correct.
Sorry about that.
Oh, not to worry. It's just a little clever play on Total Recall, Vocal Recall.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it ain't the cleverest thing on the planet. I had about 50 thoughts for the title, and I kept coming back to Vocal Recall, and I'm still convinced there's a better title out there somewhere, but since the book's already published, not much I can do about it at this point.
Yeah, well, let's talk about your book. Could you explain to me and the people who will soon be listening to this how the thought process was for writing this book, and explain what the book is all about?
Yeah, the genesis of the book was actually another voice artist you may be familiar with, Rob Paulson.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And he does this show called Talkin' Tunes, which he does on the internet, but periodically, I don't know if he still does it, but he used to book himself into live venues and do these shows live. So he invited me to join some other folks to talk about the animated show Transformers at the Improv in Hollywood. And I had some trepidation about it. I mean, this is legendary comedy club, and I am not a comedian, so how is this going to work? But actually, the place was packed with animation fans, and I had a ball. And I thought, wow, maybe if I write a monologue, I could book myself into other venues, do the monologue, and then take questions. But I started writing this monologue, and I suddenly realized at a certain point, this is no longer a monologue. I don't know, it's too long. I don't know what it is at this point. And then, because I never thought I could write a book in a million years. And I didn't dare say to myself, oh, I'm writing a book. I'd play this game with myself, and I would say, I'm not writing a book. I'm just writing this chapter. And what happens after that, nobody knows. And I just kept writing chapters and chapters. And at a certain point, I realized, you can see the finish line, pal. I think you have a book. And that's what happened. And it's an autobiography. It's basically my life. But I don't really tell you a lot about my personal situation. It's all about my career, what led me to do these various things. And sprinkled in it are hopefully interesting and or hilarious anecdotes about stuff that happened to me in the radio business, and then, of course, stuff that happened in the voiceover industry. And that's basically the book.
Yeah, I just started reading it, and it's a good read so far. I must warn you, I'm a slow reader, but I'm enjoying it very much. And, it covers your career and things in between. It's a very interesting book. So,
thank you. I'm glad you're in.
Do you have plans on writing a second book, or not yet?
Yeah, I don't know what I would write. I've toyed with the idea of a fictional thing about radio, but then I'm thinking, who would want to read this? I mean, there's a bunch of us older folks who remember the heyday of AM top 40 radio, but I mean, young people today are dimly aware of it, if at all, and I don't know that they'd even want to read a book about it. And then it's a funny thing, I seem to lack the imagination to think up really interesting plots. And I've thought about, just maybe writing about real stuff that happened. And I don't know if I've got enough there for a book. So, long story short, I suspect this may be my one and only book.
Well, there's still time. You never know.
Yeah. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, my next question is, what do you find is the most challenging part or the most difficult part for you being a voiceover actor in the industry?
Well, on a very practical level, the traffic in Los Angeles. I mean, getting from point A to point B in this city is not easy. That has been sort of solved partially by my home studio, but there are certain projects where they just will not do it that way. I've got to physically be there. Mm-hmm. And that part, I mean, I've been banging around this city since 1978, and it gets old. I am really tired of looking at some other guy's license plate as we creep along at 3 miles an hour. It's the other thing that's frustrating is the casting process. You are sort of 6 layers below the person who is going to actually make the decision as to which talent they use. And it's sort of like that telephone game. I don't know if you ever played it. You sit in a circle and somebody whispers a phrase, and then by the time it gets around the circle, it doesn't have any resemblance to what started, right? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like that. You walk into an audition and somebody, I think they want this, but I don't know. That doesn't make sense, does it? Oh, God, I don't know what to do. Just do the best you can. And I'm going, oh, Lord, if I just had access to the person who's casting this thing, Not so that I could, play mental games and try to win them over, just to have them tell